we're going to go now to the subject of custody disputes. And many of you know Kristen Zurich. Kristen Zurich is, she heads our litigation department at Cordell Cordell. She's the partner who is our lead litigator. And she trains the litigation team. She oversees our training program at Cordell College. And she does a lot of speaking as a litigator and a family practitioner. She's been with us 10 years. And I'm sure she's loved every moment of it. Isn't that fair to say, Chris?
Absolutely, Joe.
And she's always utterly frank with me on topics like that. So anyway, so I think the topic today you'll really like. She's being joined by Dr. Brian Bergstrom, who is a professor at Maryville University, graduated PhD from WashU. He has done some research regarding a very unique perspective, and I think what represents the future regarding the arguments about attachment in custody disputes. Kristen, in fact, has used him a number of times to consult with for purposes of preparation for custody issues at trial, and she's convinced that his arguments have been the difference between succeeding and failing for her. So, so with that, let's welcome Kristen and Dr. Bergstrom. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good morning. So the idea for this presentation came out of a really tough initial consult that I had a couple of months ago. I had a young kid come in, and by young kid I mean he was about 23 or 24, who was telling me that him and his girlfriend were breaking up, and that he was of the belief that he and his girlfriend were going to share week-on, week-off custody with a 7-month-old baby. And so everybody in the audience that practices this knows full well that's not going to happen. So I had to start sharing information with him and tell him, well, I'm sorry, sir, even if you guys agree to this, there's a good chance the judge isn't going to sign off on it, that it doesn't meet the developmental needs of the child. And this guy started cross-examining me like there was no tomorrow. And so we got through the consult. At some point in the conversation, I hit my ceiling of my knowledge on this. So I turned around and called somebody who was smarter than me, who could teach me a little bit more about it. So Brian and I met for coffee, and he's going to share with you guys a lot of what he shared with me that morning. I hope you find it as interesting as I've done. And I'll be interjecting every once in a while Brian's speaking to sort of help frame some of the psychological arguments with what we do in our practice. Go ahead, Brian.
Good morning, everyone. You have a psychologist in front of you. I can say definitely at this point that for those of you that have the misguided notion that psychologists are somehow privileged at reading people's minds, that's not true. And no, we're not sort of analyzing your past and wondering about your parental relationships. But to talk about attachment, I want to start off here with a few different scenarios that I'm guessing map onto some experiences that you've had. Attachment is a topic in psychology that has a robust literature behind it. It's been studied for many, many years. But with regard to public understanding and how it's typically construed and understood and applied, there's a wide variety of notions. And I think this is problematic because we use the word attachment in a very conventional way all the time. People talk about being attached to their phones and their cars, right? So the word attachment itself might lend itself to misunderstanding. But I'll read through a couple of these here. With mutual acrimony, Mr. and Mrs. S cannot bear to look at each other. The judge decides to delay overnight visitation with a non-custodial parent until their 15-month infant is 3 years, because to do so earlier would be damaging to the infant's attachment. So there's a very clear indication that notions of attachment, ideas of attachment are at play as decisions are unfolding. But what does attachment really mean? And can we get clearer about that? Second one here, an order is made for an 18-month infant to travel hundreds of miles per week between parents to spend, quote, substantial time with each so that father has equal opportunity to form a strong attachment relationship. If you misapply what we know about attachment, you could inadvertently and needlessly make things a lot worse for the child as they grow up. So I know in the span of time that we have here, we need to give sort of a surface investigation here, but at least if we can steer ourselves away from certain misunderstandings, we definitely stand to leave kids in a better place. A few more I'll let you look at on your own. I need a walker.
These things that Brian has up on our screen right now are things that he has pulled from some of his scholarly articles. So I'm sure people in the audience are going, oh, you know, our judges don't deal with this stuff. I'm here to tell you that they do. I tried a relocation case last year, and in the judge's order in St. Louis County, one of our commissioners, she laid out a pretty detailed argument about her concern about whether or not the child could maintain his attachment to mom if he was allowed to move. I also just serendipitously had a client email me last night. He's living out of state, his kids are here. He is concerned about the child's attachment to him when he comes to see him. And so this just came up in my practice last night at 7:30. So I'm sure you folks are all seeing this as well in your practice.
Do these resonate for you to some extent? A few more. The difficult thing about this, I think, is that in almost all cases, the intentions are benign. The intentions are noble, but if the science permits us, if it allows us to go further and articulate an understanding of child development in a way that can actually inform parenting plans, it would be good to know that. A few more here. You've seen these? Okay. So as a psychologist with a background in cognitive and emotional development, what we do is we look at the brain as our hardware, and you can think of the mind as our mental software. It's actually more than a mere analogy, for what it's worth. Every organ system in the body has a function. The brain's job is to process information and deliver information to programs that inform our decisions, our emotions, and our thoughts. And so when we think of childhood attachment, I would actually encourage you to think of it as a system, as a psychological adaptation that's instantiated in the brain and does the job of taking in information from the outside world to process an understanding of what to expect as you grow up. What does the world look like? Right? Am I worthy of care and love and devotion from other people, and can I rely on other people in return? And I'll unpack that in more detail in just a second here. Okay, so aside from the word of attachment, to really try and think of it as an organizing system. By the way, I should mention, we will get into more specific details. My goal here is to give you a quick, short introduction to attachment, but then we will talk about specific examples and how to apply this. To think of it as an organizing system that provides these two functions, a secure base and a haven of safety. And if you're thinking that those words are especially flowery, I'm right there with you, actually. But the point is they nicely capture what's going on with the system. That a parent, it doesn't need to be a parent, but a parent, caregiver, serving as a secure base, meaning that the child can move out away from them. Think of a time when you've seen a child, you're in a family gathering, you're around people that the child hasn't seen, and they grab your leg and they cling to you, right? Not knowing, it's a very frightening environment. It's new. I don't know these people. But then gradually over the course of the next hour or so, they get comfortable. They inch away. Or that's a case where the parent is able to serve as a secure base, enabling a degree of comfort that then allows the child to go out and explore its environment, to play, to interact with other people, to have important developmentally appropriate experiences. The haven of safety refers to being able to treat the attachment figure as someone to turn to when frightened. Right? So if there is something alarming that's going on, if you've fallen and scraped your knee, if someone said something really bad about you at school, then you feel that you can turn to this person. They will be a source of comfort in that moment. Okay. Now you notice this very complex graph here on the side. What that's getting at is the extent to which, if I can come down here, the extent to which the parenting styles that you see, what parents actually do in and out, different experiences over the course of the day, over weeks and months, the extent to which it feeds into this attachment system. And you can see down here, I've got sort of this crude model of a radar and the brain that's being active. In the same way that your phone will search for a Wi-Fi signal, whether you want it to or not. It literally flies under the radar, right? The attachment system is doing that. Throughout daily interactions, it's scanning the social environment for information about what the world is like. about whether this caregiver is serving as a secure base, as a haven of safety, and it's using that information to inform its understanding of what to expect from the world. So, let me see here.
So Brian, before we
Yes,
move on, I
yes.
think it would be really, really helpful if you could give us all some examples of some of this parenting styles, because I know I'm mentally going through my client list right now and trying to categorize people as you have them on the chart. So I think it would be helpful if you gave everybody some examples of, for example, what a consistently unresponsive parent would be.
Okay, so a parent that demonstrates consistency and is responsive would be the kind of parent that, when the child falls down and skins their knee, they go to the parent seeking assistance, and the parent is there for them, first of all, willing to offer help and saying, okay, it's okay. They will help calm them down. A very young child doesn't have the capacity to self-regulate in the way that you and I can, and they'll help the child get through it. Right? So if they're able to do that and across different domains, so for schooling matters, for physical things, for sport activity and so on, seeing a consistent responsiveness is what will foster a secure attachment style. Consistently unresponsive, these are cases where parents they might be there, but they're not delivering what the child actually needs. So in the moment that the child cries out, the parent says something like, look what you did. You made a mess. No, you go pick it up. Stop crying. Go pick it up, right? Or I told you this was going to happen, and now look, your knee is bleeding, so you go get a Band-Aid yourself, right? So they're consistently demonstrating either a lack of willingness to or an inability to provide the kind of comfort that the child is needing, which ultimately produces what's called an avoidant attachment style. And I'll get more clear on all that in just a second. Inconsistently responsive is a case where the parent is sometimes there, sometimes not. Right? And you can even see this within a given event, right? I mean, most of you are parents, so I'm sure you've had the moment where, your child wants to get a glass of milk or something, or they want to read another book before bedtime. Your patience is tried. You've got work to do after they go to bed. But you're calm and judicious, and you help them get back to bed. But then at some point they cross the line, and you lash out, and you might yell and do something that you wouldn't. From the child's brain perspective, that's inconsistent. On the one hand, it seems stable and kind and warm and responsive. On the other one, it seems a bit reactive. And so it's unclear what to expect. And when that is protracted over time, then you get this sort of, I'll call it an anxious attachment style. Down here at the bottom, this is the worst. The worst that you can get, the disorganized attachment, which happens when the parent or the caregiver is not able to serve in any way to help organize the child's thoughts about social relationships. So if a child is needing to reach out to a parent for help, and the parent breaks down and starts to cry, right? You can imagine a child saying, I miss dad or I miss mom, and the parent has thoughts of the divorce in mind. They lose the ability in the moment to regulate their own emotions, and so they're not able to respond in any way to the child. That fosters a disorganized attachment, and that's actually a very strong predictor of future psychological disorder, the propensity for developing depression, anxiety disorders, and so on. Now, you might be wondering at this point why you should care about this. What are the outcomes that actually emerge from this? And the point really centers on this internal working model. That's not helpful. There we go. The internal working model refers to your understanding of self and others. So over many, many interactions with caregivers, like the first 3 years, so none of this there are no one-offs, it's not a few months, but gradually over the course of years, these brain centers are taking in information to generate an understanding of you as a person. Am I worthy of love, affection, care, and investment from other people? And can I generally trust other people? Can I rely on others when I need help? Can I turn to others? The best way to think about these different attachment styles, wondering where they come from, is in terms of the brain trying to prepare the child for the world at hand. that a child never knows what the world is like. You're born into this world, and so what's it going to be like? If it's the case that your environment that you're growing up in is one where, yeah, people do care about you and you can rely on other people, then a secure attachment style makes sense. Right? That's a good, promising, adaptive way to move forward in your life. If it's consistently unresponsive, if your caregivers aren't there for you, or they're very sharp and caustic and not able to help you regulate, then it might be a terribly unreliable environment that you're living in. Right? Think of warfare. In a refugee camp, right? It's very hard to foster secure attachment styles. So you might be better off learning to go it alone. Kids, they tend not to reach out to others for help, for assistance, but rather to keep it on the inside and process it that way. What's remarkable about that, we'll come back to this later, but what's remarkable about this is that even in those moments, a child who might show no outward appearance of being upset, they still show a full-blown physiological stress response on the inside. So they've learned to conceal the outward appearance, but they're still feeling it internally. And that can have a corrosive effect on brain development and on subsequent social relationships. If you have inconsistent responding, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not, then it might be the case that people in your environment are willing to invest, but it's not easy to get them to do that. It might not be a resource that comes easily or that's widely available. And so maybe you should make extra effort to seek that out. So you get behaviors that are especially clingy, right? Clinging to parents, later on in older relationships, seeking constant validation, right? I know you say that you love me, but I don't feel confident that you do, so I need to seek that reassurance repeatedly. All of these sort of average or general descriptions tie into, ultimately, these early experiences with caregivers. It's a rough default approach to the world. And if you think about it, it makes good sense biologically, not knowing what the world will be like. You could use this early information as a way of gauging what the future world is going to be like. It nudges you towards particular behaviors that will tend to be adaptive if the environment stays the same way. In this case, because there really is no organization, right? The child hasn't learned whether they can depend on people or not, but it's very skewed, very disorganized. They're not getting the kind of input they need to the system. Then you get typically very profound social deficits. Okay. The next one here. Okay. Any questions about this?
I do.
Yes.
Can you give us a sense of, some of us are parents and we all have clients who will point to that one instance. Is there kind of an idea of percentages, or, no parent is ever 100% consistent, 100% perfect. So, an idea of like, maybe you generally are consistently responsive, but in the middle of a divorce and you're fighting, maybe on those days you become a little bit more unresponsive, or like a sense of proportions, if you will, in terms of that chart. Before you start seeing problems and the court might say, this isn't in the best interest. We're trying to gauge that a little bit.
The unhelpful answer is that it depends, but the true answer is that it depends. But in part, it depends on the age of the child. Oh, sorry, right. The question is, in terms of proportionality, given that, the best parents, or the best among us, are not able to be completely consistent all the time, is there sort of a proportion, like a ratio, right? Is that?
Yeah, like trying to gauge the best interest for the child, at which point, no parent is going to be perfect, so at which point is it the court going to say this is the best? Could you testify this is no longer in the best interest of the child? This parent is 80% of the time consistently responsive, but this is 20% of the time, then this is going to be a problem.
Well, I would expect full well that in that situation you're talking about, the judge would be more focused on how the kid is actually reacting to the parent rather than what indeed the parent is doing. And so Brian has a really helpful graph a couple of slides in that maybe we can come back to your question at that time, and I think it might help frame our answer to you a little bit better.
Okay. I will say this, though, that one big factor is language. That if you have a child who is in the first 3 years, and they don't have the ability to linguistically conceptualize what's happening, then those in-the-moment responsive actions matter more, because that's all they have. If they can't understand what's happening, then all they have is the physical interaction. Whereas for a much older child, if you can sit them down and explain to them what's going on, then cases where you're not always there or not responsive in the way you might want to be, they can understand that and not. It wouldn't have the same effect, basically. But we will come back to that. Okay. So this is one way to break down the different attachment styles, intersecting them with an internal working model. And I'm imagining that you can sort of place yourself here to some extent. That if you have a secure attachment style, then you're likely to feel confident about yourself, having low anxiety about yourself, and a positive model of others. And if that's the case, then you feel comfortable turning to other people and letting people rely on you, whereas someone who is anxious would have a poor view of themselves, right? They would maybe not feel confident that they are worthy of a lot of love and affection, but they have a positive view of others. They want it from other people. They're just not sure that they deserve it or that they can sustain it in relationships. And then avoidant attachment styles can be hashed out down here. In general, they have a negative view of others. You can't trust people. It's best not to have to rely on people. It's much better to go it alone. But within that approach, you can have either a dismissing sort of approach where you might have lots of relationships, lots of friendships, lots of people, but they're not very strong. You don't disclose personal information in those relationships. You don't want to get very close to people, right? Or you can have one that is more fearful, where you don't enjoy or appreciate or value social relationships at all. So you get sort of a centering, a sort of turning inward. So this might be a person who would prefer to listen to music rather than ever interact with a person. They'll lose themselves in their art or other kind of work rather than reach out and engage in social relationships. Okay. So that might be hard to see from back there, but you do have the slides. So these are the kinds of behavioral characteristics that are associated with these different styles. And I'm guessing you can imagine now why this matters a bit more from your perspective. That some of these profiles are more desirable than others as a child grows up and enters adulthood. So in a secure attachment style, right, having a positive view of others, a positive view of yourself, leads to proactive interdependence, right? Comfortable with being close with other people, being able to trust others and be calmed by them, whereas individuals that have an anxious attachment have the negative view of self but a positive view of others. They might be increasingly dependent on people, other people, and so on.
So this is the slide that I thought would answer your question most effectively. And so realistically, when you're in a contested custody litigation, you're likely going to have a guardian ad litem, and your parents are likely to be more attuned to the kids and what they're feeling and how they're acting. And so if you have kids that are aggressive and clingy upon separation, or kids that are self-harming or abusive, that's usually when some pretty intensive therapy is ordered for the children. And then that's when the guardian or the judge starts to look at parenting styles, and that's usually what triggers custody evaluations and those kinds of things. And so there is no, if you have a client that's coming to you and freaking out saying, oh my God, I yelled at my kid when I was reading to him, one instance isn't going to be hugely harmful to the child, but every single night if the parent disassociates from the child because they're so focused on the divorce, it has some pretty profoundly negative impacts on the kids, which the court system is going to try to fix.
Yeah. So let me pull this up so you can see this. This, in general, these consequences emerge in a robust fashion in study after study after study. And these studies have been going on for several decades now, so there's a very rich empirical basis for making these claims. You can see that children who are securely attached tend to do better in school. They do better with their friendships, when they enter emotional or romantic relationships as well. And if you think about all of that in the context of what you just saw, it might make sense, because think of it, if you're securely attached and you're struggling in school, math is hard for me right now, you might be likely to say something like, God, this is really a difficult, anyone else struggle with this? Right? Can you help me out? Did you get this? Right? You're going to reach out to other people. You might talk to the teacher about what you could do. You might be likely to form a study group with other students. Whereas if you have an avoidant attachment style, well, first of all, you're not going to let anyone know you're struggling. Why am I going to make my problems anyone else's problems? That just opens me up to potential dangers, right? To let people know that I'm vulnerable in this way. So you're not going to reach out in the same way. You're not going to take advantage of opportunities that are actually right in front of you in the same way. And that's going to translate ultimately into poor academic performance. Someone who's insecurely anxious, they might be likely to reach out, but they also might be likely to say, well, my friend here says that math is dumb. And I care very deeply about what they say and what they think, and my friendship with them is so important that I'm going to say that math is really dumb too. Right? So the approach you take to learning and to other relationships is can be nudged in this way that then ultimately translates into these kinds of outcomes. Comments or questions about that? Yeah.
I just want to know, what do you think about being on to golf for a very young child, like under 3?
We'll actually get to that in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, generally, yeah, but I promise we'll get there. It's a good and important question.
Make sure everybody.
Thank you. I have a quick question on when you're dealing with custody and attachment, is it affected if the household has a lot of changing household members on a consistent basis, basically an unstable family situation? Can that take away or increase attachment?
It depends on whether the instability is with the, if the household contains a primary attachment figure, typically, right, one parent, if that relationship is not affected by the changing nature, then it shouldn't be a problem. But if the changing dynamics of the household do influence that relationship, such that mom or dad are no longer as available as they were, they're busy, putting out fires with other family members and so on, then that can have an impact in this regard. Yeah. Okay. So take a moment and place yourself in one of these three. This goes back a number of years. To psychologists who were looking at how early attachment dynamics cast this long shadow on subsequent experiences and subsequent relationships, and why it matters in these cases. Assessing adults, asking adults questions to figure out what their early attachment relationship was likely like, and then asking them to endorse one of these three paragraphs as best describing them in a romantic capacity. And what they found is that those who were securely attached as children were overwhelmingly likely to endorse this description of themselves in romantic relationships, which, if you think about it, makes sense because you have this sense that, yeah, I can trust other people, and yeah, I'm worthy of being loved. So I find it easy to get close to others. I'm okay depending on them and letting them depend on me. I don't worry about being abandoned or about someone getting too close. Individuals that grew up with an avoidant attachment style were overwhelmingly likely to endorse this one. I'm a little uncomfortable being close to others. I find it difficult to trust them completely. I don't open up that quickly. I'm slow to warm. I don't want to self-disclose information. It's difficult to allow myself to depend on them. If I have a bad day, I'd rather deal with it on my own. I don't need a hug, right? I don't want to talk about it. I don't need you to help me troubleshoot. Just let me be. I'm nervous whenever anyone gets too close, and often others want me to be more intimate than I feel comfortable being, right? So I need my space, right? Okay. And finally, down here, those that grew up with an anxious attachment style were most likely to endorse this one. It's not perfect, but the averages bear out in a very clear way, and they have consistently in different studies. I find it the others are reluctant to get as close as I would like, right? I want this relationship. I value this relationship, but I don't feel confident that I am worthy of love and affection from other people and investment, long-term investment. So I might be a little paranoid and constantly worrying a bit that my partner doesn't really love me, that they won't stay invested, that they might be thinking about abandoning the relationship. I want to get very close to my partner, and this sometimes scares people away.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah.
Can kids change their attachment styles?
They can. Enormously important. In fact, we'll see in a couple slides here that not only can you have different attachment styles with different parents, you could have a child who's securely attached to dad, but is either anxiously or avoidantly attached to mom. But you can also change over the course of the lifespan. So you think of this as sort of a default setting, in the same way that when you get a new TV or a computer or even a new piece of software, there's that setup period where you have to go through the annoying process of specifying what your preferences are. And if you skip by that and you want to go back and change, you can go back and change things, but it's a more difficult task. So you've got this sort of default approach to social relationships, but then the system stays open, so that in response to new relationships, if you grow up insecurely, either anxious or avoidant, but you have that solid friendship in adolescence, or you marry someone that is sort of your rock and you can rely on, then you see a shifting away from that insecure attachment style to a secure one, and vice versa. Yeah.
How quickly can you assess the attachment style and the parenting style? Because I've had a couple times where I've done a few pieces similar to you, and I feel like it hasn't been very helpful. I guess because they've matched over time, and then I've got to like pretty much either really help my case or really hurt my case. And I guess my question is, how long on average does it take to assess an assessment style, whether one of the parents is alienating the other parent or alienating the child? It's kind of a technical question, I apologize. Would it require like weekly meetings or a 1 week meeting or?
That's good. There are, for very young children, there are formal assessments that you can use that will give you a very good picture right off the bat. So in a single day, you've got a picture. But as the child gets older, then it becomes more difficult to do that. And the best bet would be to use a therapeutic context, where a therapist that knows attachment theory well is able to look for clues over a series of sessions. Yeah. Other questions?
So Brian, in that quadrant, from secure to fearful, looking at my own children, their friends, and their relationship, and then of my nephews and nieces, it seems like the pattern I've seen over and over is the people that are in that secure attachment quadrant, they attract, either friends or relationship-wise, a lot of the anxious attachment type people. So the question I have, is it that attraction there, is part of it that people in that quadrant are kind of, their goal is maybe to move to the secure attachment quadrant? Is that why you see that dynamic happening over and over again?
I wouldn't say that, not a goal in any explicit sense.
Right.
But certainly there is that desire to find someone that will be a stable source of interaction. So yeah, I think that in the sense that most of us would, right, regardless of these, that if you come across a relationship that serves that function, right, then you would want that. But as a conscious motive or goal, probably not.
Not conscious, but maybe on some lower level.
But yeah, from a motivational perspective, you simply feel drawn to a person, or do you feel especially satisfied with that interaction of that relationship?
Well,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and it's not just that person, but their greater familial environment, that they see, they can understand why this person is so secure because the rest of the support structure they have around.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you've known people like this when you were growing up, where the family is very open and everyone is very trusting, and so it's a very communal sort of environment where people very clearly, they value themselves as individuals, but the family in general, they rely on each other as needed. They fight a lot too, but that's, that too emerges as part of the trusting nature of those interactions. So yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Other comments or questions before moving to implications that we can?
When we started this group this time, there were a couple cases cited about courts. Is that really happening? It seems to go to a court in the past for special custody arrangements or parenting plan based upon my own observations of the child or the wishes of the parent. Where does this fit in real life?
Sure, this fits in real life is if there has been a negative influence on a child, or if a child has been pulled away from another potential attachment figure, the judge is going to look to find some ways to make sure that the child has a chance to attach with the other parent. For example, I have a client that lives in West Virginia, and he has to come up here on an every other weekend basis to see his child because mom will not let the child come down to West Virginia to see him. And so our first pretrial conference, our judge was very, very concerned about the cost associated with my client having to come up here and the mental cost to the child of not having much contact with dad, albeit in a super fun environment at a hotel. So now we're actively working towards longer stretches of time with the child, with my client in West Virginia, and to have the dad spend at least a week with the child so that the kid knows that dad can do those same kinds of things that mom can do. He just hasn't had the opportunity to do it because of the distance.
Yeah. Does that?
Well, it's one of those questions about the other plan.
My hope is that as we go through these, we'll approximate an answer there. Okay. So how does this pan out for you? Why does this matter to you? To what extent can this be used to design or nudge a parenting plan in one direction or another? We can say that in the first 3 years, there should be a primary attachment figure, which is simply to say that those 3 years are primary, that the attachment system is booting up during that period. And so any dysregulation of the family environment is likely to have more of an impact on subsequent development than it would if there were a disruption later in life. So the better able we are to really affirm a primary attachment relationship, the better off a child would be. That doesn't mean that there can't be other attachment relationships. There can be. Children typically will attach to both caregivers if they're both there. And importantly, that if there is, for example, if there are no overnights, for example, that doesn't prevent the other parent from still fostering and having a secure attachment with the child. The goal is really to establish regularity. There has to be that consistency. There has to be that regularity in the emotional health that helps the child, the parent, to regulate the child's emotional state. Infants don't have gender biases. The attachment system does not depend on the presence of a mother. For biological reasons, there often is an attachment with the mother, but we can say that in cases where there is no mother present, that the child is perfectly able to attach to the father, to a grandparent, or anyone else that can serve as the secure base or a haven of safety. That's really the primary key. In fact, you could define an attachment relationship as just being one in which a particular adult individual serves in that capacity. They serve as a secure base or a haven of safety. That's really the key there. And so even in some cases, if you have a much older sibling, an older, a brother or sister that's 8 years older, and they take on some primary responsibilities of caregiving, they too can become an attachment figure because they're serving that function. They then are providing the input to the brain systems that process those experiences. So importantly, I think, is that overnights are not necessary for attachment formation. In some sense, this should be obvious because, I mean, no attachment can happen while you're asleep, right? Because you're asleep. But the kinds of experiences, the kinds of moments where the child is having difficulty. They're struggling with, dinner, right? They have to eat this and they don't want to, right? Or they're frustrated because they want to watch this video and you're saying, no, it's time to take a bath. All of those are moments. Those are the moments that the attachment system will take as input. I'm upset. What does my caregiver do? That's it. And so if that's what the attachment system is looking for, then the overnight, the end of the day procedure of putting a child to bed will serve as input to the attachment system, but it's not necessary. A parent that had, say, 2 or 3 days a week of interaction with the child, that would be sufficient in the first 3 years for a child to develop a full attachment relationship with the other parent.
So those of you that have been practicing long enough to remember Judge Gokey's old developmental plan where from 0 to 1, the client would just have day visits with the child every other couple of days. This is some of the psychology behind as to why it was structured in that way. And then as the child got older, then the overnight started to expand a little bit because the child was more open and had the ability to experience, I guess, more in-depth attachment, like they're playing with their parents, they're understanding a lot more, rather than just the day-to-day based caregiving that you have with an infant.
Yeah. With regard to the 3-year mark, we could say that it's not so much the age per se. I mean, it's not as though, on the 3rd birthday you could sort of move. The real measure should be at what point the child can understand what's happening. Right? If they can really conceptualize that you're moving to a different household or sleeping environment for a day or 2, but then you're going to come back to the other parent, that's what really matters. That's the point at which it becomes easier to do it without disrupting the attachment process. Okay. The amount of time that a parent and child have together, it matters much less than the quality of the time. From an attachment perspective, the parent that sits their kid down in front of the TV and lets them watch movies, or lets them go off and do all sorts of things, the kid might be having a blast. They're having a very good time doing lots of fun things, but that's not actually going to foster an attachment relationship or reinforce and maintain an attachment relationship if it doesn't include the kind of one-on-one interactions, the sort of what are called rupture and repair moments where you get upset about something and you see how the parent responds. Right? There need to be those key interactions. So the quality is far more important than the quantity of time. Indeed, you can imagine a parent who has lots of money, doesn't need to work, they're able to stay at home with the child, spend lots of time with them, can afford the best schools, but they're completely detached, right? They're checked out. They're not emotionally stable themselves. So providing all these materials to the child isn't going to do the work of attachment for them.
So those of you that are practicing and out there doing this on a daily basis, so if you have a judge that is suggesting that perhaps a custody schedule for the age of the child that you have isn't what your client wants, but this is what the judge is sort of forcing you guys to do, this gives you some of the psychological background here to be able to pat him on the back and say, I know you don't have as much time as you want right now, but if you focus on the quality of the time with your child, as your plan steps up to something more expansive, your relationship with your kid will be better for it.
I'm guessing none of you are feeling that your lives weren't categorically and fatalistically determined by the first 3 years, right? That your relationships with your parents and with those that you know changed, of course, over time. So the promise of this is also the fact that it's open. It remains responsive throughout life. So as long as you're able to foster, initiate, and form this basic attachment relationship early on, then you've got something to work with that you can develop in later years. Okay. So attachment is a process. To sort of hammer this home, I pull a quote from the literature here, just emphasizing this point, that the function of attachment is not simply emotional, not just about sort of in-the-moment feeling, and not simply relational, about having that constant contact with the caregiver or being there at every single moment. The parent's role as a secure base and a support for exploration, right, haven of safety, includes helping the child construct mental representations and an understanding of themselves and the environment. You can't give the child these understandings. Right? You can't sit down and tell a child that, you know, I love you and I really do care about you and I want the best for you, and then not demonstrate it in the actions that unfold every day, right? The verbal component, if they understand it, they can use that to some extent. They can rely on that when they're coping, but the verbal content is not the input that the attachment system processes. The attachment system wants to know, what are you doing in this moment? Are you there for me? How do you respond? That's what really drives the development of attachment, and so they have to learn through interaction with their caregivers. I think that many parents, especially in divorce contexts, are looking to see, you know, whether the child is happy. I want them to be happy. I want them, right, at every moment, don't be sad, don't cry, don't worry, don't be anxious. And that's fine, but that's transitory. It's sort of in-the-moment emotional well-being. And if the means by which you achieve that chronic happiness comes at the expense of providing these kinds of judicious responses to in the moment, then you might actually be doing inadvertently a disservice to the child over time. Okay. In the early years, frequency of contact is necessary to establish the attachment relationship, ideally 2 to 3 times per week. So if there's an arrangement where there are no overnights, the other parent, if their goal is to establish an attachment relationship with the child, should aim for about 2 to 3 times per week.
And Martha, I guess that speaks to your question you gave us before. That's why week on, week off for a young child doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right, Brian?
Yes, that could actually be incredibly corrosive, actually. Even if the child, you know, enjoys a different environment, the fact that there isn't that regularity, right? You're developing this person as a go-to. They're there to organize your activities and to be a responsive source. If that is flipping back and forth, then you can't establish that in a long-term way. You're providing sort of mixed messages to the attachment system that could be inadvertently compromising. If grandparents or other caregivers become secondary attachment figures, then court orders should support those. The attachment system doesn't know family relationships. So if a grandparent is heavily involved in the daily care of a child, it's very likely that the child will be developing a full-blown attachment relationship with them. And if you summarily remove the grandparent from the relationship because they're not a biological parent, that is very likely going to have damaging consequences to the child.
Well, think about this, you guys. How many times do you have cases where you have a preschooler and they maybe go to school 2 or 3 times a week and grandma and grandpa take care of the kids the rest of the time? I mean, it's pretty significant in my practice. And then when I have the kid finally get to the point of kindergarten, grandma and grandpa aren't watching those kids anymore for 2 days a week. So this is something I step all over every time in my practice, and it was a nice reminder that maybe I need to be a little more cognizant of the changes that I'm making to the child's life when I'm working on a parenting plan.
Any comments about this, the experiences?
This is going to extend a little bit maybe to the age of 5, but I've got some cases where I have a non-custodial parent who's on the other side of the country. Both parents get along, but it's just a question of logistics. Parent B, the non-custodial parent, can only make it into town so often and has some desire that we take, whether the child is 1-year-old, 2-year-old, send them to the other side of the country for a month at a time when really there has been no frequent contact, no overnights, no nothing. And it's a little bit unusual. Both parents kind of have their hearts and minds in the right place, and yet it's an unusual situation
So realistically, in your case, the parents are shipping the kid completely across the country for a month at a time?
They're not.
Oh, that's what,
The non-custodial parent would like to do that.
oh,
And
okay.
I can only come into town so often. And, you know, maybe later in life, that makes sense.
Right.
But when we're talking about 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, I have a couple of these where
Right.
it just doesn't seem to make sense, and nobody seems to want to, you know, of course, maybe that's where experts come in, obviously, and they're getting along, they're talking, but it's just.
Right. It's trying to figure out what fits a mold that's not exactly something you see all the time, and that's what makes it tough. In a similar situation I have, such as yours, the most the judge was willing to do was about 10 days at a time. That taking the child, especially one that young, away from the custodial parent that they've made an attachment to for longer than a period of about 10 days, the judge was unwilling to do it and thought that it was really developmentally inappropriate. Yeah. Right. Right, then maybe it involves some sort of a creative solution to the problem, because obviously there's airfare costs. Then maybe it becomes I pay off-chart support, so I pay less than the chart tells me to, but then the extra money that I have, I use to help fly back and forth to help foster the child's psychological development a little more appropriately.
It would depend on if it's a 1-year-old and they don't have an established pattern of interaction, if they didn't have time before the transition to establish an attachment relationship, it's probably not going to happen in these brief time. It requires, to set it up in the first place at any age requires a consistency. I mean, there needs to be regular. So, yeah. But if it's the case where the attachment relationship has been formed and they're a bit older, then you can actually get away with, this is the wrong way to put it, but get away with less frequent contact. In fact, it's that in here. We have that. Thought we had that in here. But as a child gets older, I mean, we all know this, that we have loved ones, even our parents that still serve as emotional touchstones. You can have a phone call. A phone call is enough to literally we say, touch base with people. And so in that case, it's different, but it depends on, whether they have established it or not.
FaceTime, things like that, you know, on a lower level, still, if there's contact on a day-to-day basis, it's still.
Meaningful, maybe, but meaningful from an attachment perspective, probably not. Yeah, because that's actually very important, I think, because if Skype doesn't permit you to have those sorts of responsive interactions, then no matter how much time you spend in that regard, it's not going to feed into the attachment system.
Hey, Brian. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's the technology, FaceTime, Skype, whatever, it's not like easier to hold them, but at least you have a situation where a child doesn't even know what the person looks like. So I've had kids where they did like FaceTime a couple times a day, and a lot of military people do that. So although it's not the same, I think with it being so prevalent, it's not even free. Like years ago, Jim White did a presentation at the Family Law Conference about that very thing, when it was really, really new, you know, about interactive faces. And now with FaceTime and all these things, I don't even know what they're about. It's so prevalent now that I don't think that's even an excuse that if there's some distance, that you at least utilize that. That's something you can do every day.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would never say that you shouldn't do it. Just that by itself, even if you have daily FaceTime or Skype interaction, you shouldn't expect that to build the relationship. So that when you do meet them face to face, that magically somehow there's going to be this rapport that transfers through. Yeah. But that's a really good.
Certainly, I think, cuts into the excuse that a lot of mothers put up in keeping the child away from.
Right. Hey, Brian. We got about 2 more minutes, so
Sorry?
we need to wrap it up.
Okay. Are we off? 2 more. Okay. So I think this is sort of the overarching, the biggest point you could take away is that if the parent, you want to know if the parent is serving as a secure base or haven of safety. Those are the primary considerations. And if you know that a parent in a divorce context is not able to serve that, function for a child, either because they don't have time, they're stressed at work, and they're more committed to their career than to this, or because they are emotionally unstable, the divorce has sort of wreaked havoc in that way, then therapy is good. I mean, come on, even the best parents among us that are in intact families need all the help that we can get. But in a case like this, turning to other mental health professionals to help foster these relationships, to learn how to respond in different ways, that is something that mental health professionals are very, very good at.